The room was thick with the stench of blood and sweat. A single candle flickered against damp stone walls, its flame bending each time the wounded man tried to breathe. He sat slumped in a chair, his once pristine blue coat soaked through with crimson, his powdered wig gone, revealing streaks of gray in his matted hair. His face was a grotesque mask of ruin. His jaw shattered, hanging at an unnatural angle, bound clumsily with blood-soaked rags that did little to muffle the gurgling sounds escaping his throat. Every attempt at speech was met with a ghastly wheeze, a wet gargle of blood and air, as if the very voice of France had been ripped from his body. Pieces of bone, loosened by the shot that had torn through his face, slipped from between his lips and clattered against the floor like broken teeth from a skull. His eyes darted wildly, desperate, not with the authority of a man who once commanded a nation, but with the terror of a cornered animal. The guards who once feared him now leaned casually against the walls, mocking him, laughing under their breath as he struggled to form words. But no words came, no commands, no threats, only the bubbling of blood from a man drowning in his own silence. Outside, the streets of Paris were alive with anticipation. Tens of thousands gathering, their voices rising, not in fear this time, but in jubilation. The people were no longer trembling at his name. They were waiting to see his end. And here he sat, Maximilien Robespierre, the voice of the revolution, the architect of the terror, the man who silenced thousands, could no longer speak. If this chilling opening already has you gripped, stay with me. What you're about to witness is not just history. It's a nightmare that swallowed a nation. And if you want to journey deeper into the darkest corners of our past, subscribe now to Cursed Chronicles. Join our community of seekers who refuse to look away from the shadows of history. But to understand this moment of silence, this grotesque unraveling of a man who once ruled by words, we must step back into the world that created him. France, 1789. The streets reeked of hunger. Bread was scarce, prices soared beyond reason, and starving mothers clawed at bakery doors while aristocrats feasted behind gilded walls. The monarchy, bloated and blind, teetered on collapse, and the people, millions of them, seethed with desperation. In that chaos, one man's voice cut through the tumult. He was not noble nor wealthy, nor particularly imposing. But Maximilien Robespierre possessed something more dangerous than any sword, an unshakable belief that he alone understood virtue. He spoke not with passion, but with the cold conviction of a man who thought himself destiny's chosen. To him, purity was salvation, and mercy was corruption. Those who opposed him were not merely wrong, they were enemies of the people. And so, the lawyer who once denounced the death penalty as inhumane, transformed into the very architect of mechanized killing. In April 1793, Robespierre seized control of the Committee of Public Safety. Within months, it became a machine designed not to defend France, but to purge it. Every morning at 9, the committee assembled like clockwork. By 10, they had decided who would die. The numbers that followed defied comprehension. Between September 1793 and July 1794, more than 2,600 men and women were guillotined in Paris alone. In Lyon, nearly 1,900 citizens were executed, so many that mass shootings replaced the blade. In Nantes, prisoners were bound in chains, herded onto barges, and drowned by the hundreds in the Loire River, their bodies swelling, drifting for miles downstream, washing ashore to horrified villages untouched by revolution. These were not faceless statistics. They were priests who refused to renounce their faith, bakers accused of raising prices, a boy barely 14 years old who dared shout, "Long live the king," a pregnant woman whose plea to live until her child was born was met with the cold drop of a blade. Each name recorded in meticulous detail by Robespierre himself, who tallied the dead with the precision of an accountant. Virtue he claimed, justice he promised, terror he delivered. This was his paradox. A man once hailed as incorruptible, who had risen to defend the weak, now stood as the single most prolific orchestrator of death France had ever seen. His voice, once used to denounce cruelty, became the chant that justified it. What do you think? Was Robespierre a defender of virtue, or simply the most terrifying dictator France ever produced? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice, unlike his victims, deserves to be heard. The guillotine did not wait. It never slept, never faltered, never showed mercy. It stood in the heart of Paris like a steel god, its blade polished by the blood of thousands, its creak and crash as familiar to the people as church bells once had been. Each day began the same. At dawn, the condemned were dragged from cells so overcrowded that men and women slept pressed against one another like corpses in a grave. Guards read out the names in a voice stripped of feeling, and the chosen were loaded onto wooden carts. The wheels groaned across cobblestones as they rolled toward the Place de la Revolution. Children chased the carts, jeering. Crowds hurled filth, stones, and rotten bread. Some spat, others cheered. For many, this had become entertainment. The tribunal allowed no defense, no appeals. A baker accused of overcharging for bread. Guillotine. A priest refusing to swear loyalty to the Republic. Guillotine. An old nobleman carried to the scaffold because he could no longer walk. Guillotine. A boy of 14 who shouted loyalty to the king in a street fight. Guillotine. The names blurred, but the blade never hesitated. Records show that in Paris alone, 2,639 souls were executed in less than a year. In Lyon, 1,880 fell, many by mass shootings when the guillotine could not keep pace. In Nantes, barges filled with prisoners were deliberately sunk, their cries swallowed by the river, their bodies drifting for weeks down the Loire. Entire villages along the banks woke to the sight of swollen, disfigured corpses drifting past their doorsteps. Yet, to the crowd it was ritual. Each execution carried its own rhythm. The carts halted. Prisoners were pulled out, one by one, and bound. Executioner Sanson worked with mechanical precision. The condemned laid beneath the blade. The crowd counted aloud. 10, 9, 8. The steel hissed. The head dropped into wicker baskets, and lime was thrown into pits where the bodies rotted together in silence. Robespierre rarely attended in person, but he devoured reports of each death as though they were scripture. He studied their final words, their last expressions, noting whether they died with remorse or defiance. Even Marie Antoinette's composure at the scaffold was reduced in his journals to proof of her corruption. Day after day, the guillotine's song echoed across Paris until fear itself seemed to hum through the air. People whispered of friends, of neighbors, who vanished overnight, their names scratched onto lists that meant certain death. The machine had become more than an instrument of execution. It was the rhythm of a nation's terror, and Robespierre was its conductor. If this part of history shocks you, hit the like button so more people can uncover these forgotten horrors on Cursed Chronicles. By the spring of 1794, the man who once walked with calm conviction now trembled under the weight of his own creation. Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, was no longer a figure of resolve but a shadow unraveling in plain sight. He slept scarcely 3 hours a night. His left eye twitched uncontrollably during speeches, a nervous spasm he could not control. His voice, once sharp and commanding, had grown shrill, cracking into the air with a hysteria that unsettled even his most loyal allies. He began carrying a loaded pistol to meetings, laying it on the table beside his papers as if daring his colleagues to question him. In his journals, where his handwriting had once been neat and deliberate, the ink now splattered and smudged across pages. Words were scratched out, rewritten, repeated. Over and over again, he scrawled a single phrase: "The Republic of Virtue will triumph." Sometimes it filled entire pages, written 50 times or more like a chant, as though repetition could hold back the collapse he felt closing in on him. Neighbors heard him pacing late into the night, rehearsing speeches to invisible enemies, arguing with phantoms only he could see. His paranoia grew sharper each day. He stopped appearing in public except for official ceremonies, hiding behind the walls of his office while the revolution consumed itself outside. Then came the Law of 22 Prairial. In June, Robespierre pushed it through, a decree that stripped the accused of defense, lawyers, or appeal. Trials lasted minutes. Verdicts fell in silence. and the blade rose and fell without pause. Executions tripled overnight, from 5 a day to 15. It was no longer justice, not even terror. It was slaughter. His colleagues began to murmur in secret, whispers echoing in the very halls where once they had feared to breathe without his permission. They realized what he had not, that the same lists he used to destroy enemies would soon include them. And so they conspired. Fouché, Barras, Tallien. Men who knew that if they did not strike first, they would not live to see another dawn. Robespierre had built a republic of fear, but now even he was trapped within it. Imagine living under such a law, no defense, no appeal, no time. Only accusation and death. Would you have survived the reign of terror? Share your thoughts below. Would you have been the accuser or the condemned? July 27, 1794. The day began like all others in the terror, but by nightfall, the spell Robespierre had cast over France would shatter. He entered the National Convention draped in his familiar blue coat, wig powdered as if ceremony alone could preserve authority. He carried himself with the same confidence that had silenced rivals for years, certain his words would once again drown dissent. But when he rose to speak, a sound broke against him. Not applause, not silence, but fury. From the benches came a roar. "Down with the tyrant!" Another voice thundered, "You are the enemy of the people." Then the chant spread, rising like a storm he could not quell. "Death to Robespierre! Death to Robespierre!" For the first time in 3 years, his voice failed him. He stood frozen, his lips moving, his shrill tones lost beneath the avalanche of defiance. His power, built on fear and silence, collapsed in an instant. Guards moved in. He stammered, "You cannot arrest virtue. I am the representative of the people." But no one listened. The people he had claimed to embody now dragged him like any other criminal. That night, the humiliation deepened. One prison after another refused to admit him, wardens terrified of housing such a man. For hours he was marched through the streets, rejected, cast aside like refuse. Finally, he was taken to the Hôtel de Ville, where his brother and a handful of loyalists gathered, clinging to the fantasy of rescue. There, Robespierre tried to write one last speech, believing the citizens of Paris would rise for him, as they once had against the king. But outside, the streets were not filled with revolution. They were empty. The people had turned away. The man who had spoken for a nation now discovered he spoke for no one at all. If you've stayed with me this far, then you can feel it too, the unraveling of power, the chilling irony of a tyrant betrayed by his own creation. If stories like this pull you in, don't wait, subscribe now to Cursed Chronicles. Join me as we peel back the shadows of history's most cursed figures, and uncover truths far darker than fiction could ever dare. The night bled into the early hours of July 28th. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, chaos erupted as armed forces stormed the building. Shouts echoed, boots slammed against stone, and then gunfire. When the smoke cleared, Robespierre lay slumped across a table, his face torn apart by a bullet. Some swore he had tried to shoot himself, others whispered a soldier pulled the trigger, but no one could agree. What they did agree on was the horror of the wound. His jaw shattered in 3 places, his mouth hanging loose, teeth and bones spilling from the wound, his words reduced to strangled gurgles. He was still alive, still conscious. Bandages were ripped from a tablecloth and tied clumsily around his head, soaking through with blood almost instantly. For 14 long hours, he sat in agony inside the offices of the very Committee of Public Safety where he had once signed thousands of death warrants. He could hear his colleagues in the next room, celebrating his downfall, laughing, drinking, as he bled in silence. Every attempt to speak ended in a bubbling hiss. Every groan reminded him that the blade he had fed for months was now waiting for him. For the first time, Robespierre endured the same torture he had inflicted on others. The slow, suffocating terror of knowing death was certain, but not knowing the hour it would come. If this haunting turn grips you, stay with me. And don't forget, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles for more stories that reveal the darkest truths history tried to bury. By late afternoon, the death carts arrived. Robespierre was hauled from his chair and thrown among 21 of his closest allies. The streets of Paris, once silent with fear, now thundered with triumph. The journey to the Place de la Révolution, normally 45 minutes, stretched to nearly 2 hours as the crowd blocked their way. They did not greet him with silence or dread. They spat, they screamed, they hurled stones and filth at the man who had once dictated their every breath. Children ran beside the cart, mocking him, pretending to fall beneath imaginary blades, their small voices chanting in cruel play, "Off with his head! Off with his head!" Prostitutes offered themselves freely to any who could tell a tale of being wronged by him. Musicians played satirical songs in the street. Robespierre sat slumped, his bandages soaked through, his famous blue coat stained black with blood, his gray hair exposed without his powdered wig. His jaw hung open grotesquely, his chin resting on his chest. Once, his gaze alone could silence an assembly. Now he avoided every eye, a broken animal paraded before those he had ruled with terror. When the cart reached the square, 200,000 voices exploded in one of the loudest cheers Paris had ever heard. Windows rattled, stone cracked, and Robespierre, the man who believed fear itself could be a government, was greeted by the full terror of a people freed. If you can feel the weight of this moment, then join me. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles and step with me into the shadows where history's most cursed figures met their end. They dragged him up the scaffold steps, each movement jarring the wound that had silenced him. The crowd pressed closer, cramming into windows, rooftops, balconies, every vantage point packed with faces eager to see the monster undone. Nearly 200,000 souls bore witness, their shouts merging into a roar that made the very air tremble. Then came the final cruelty. Executioner's assistants tore away the filthy bandages from his shattered jaw. The wound gaped open, raw and grotesque, and from Robespierre's throat erupted a scream. Not human, but something deeper, a sound torn from the marrow of suffering. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the crowd. And then, from somewhere in the masses, a voice cried, "That is the scream of all his victims." The silence broke into chaos. Cheers, laughter, sobs of relief. People shouted, danced, embraced. The square transformed into a festival of vengeance. The blade was raised, gleaming in the late sun, and in a single swift stroke, it fell. Robespierre's head dropped into the basket, his body pitched into the pit. But unlike so many others, this execution did not end in quiet dispersal. The crowd erupted with a joy no guillotine had ever seen. Songs filled the air, wine poured into the streets, effigies of Robespierre were set alight in flames. It was not the death of a man they celebrated. It was the death of terror itself. If this moment chills you, remember, there are more stories buried in history, darker than fiction dares to tell. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles now, and together we'll drag these shadows back into the light. News of his death spread like fire through the veins of France. In Lyon, where nearly 2,000 had fallen to mass shootings, citizens built a bonfire of furniture seized from the executed and hurled effigies of Robespierre into the flames. In Marseille, church bells rang for 6 hours straight, their tolling joined by cannon fire from ships in the harbor. In Bordeaux, merchants uncorked their finest bottles, handing wine to strangers in the streets. For the first time in years, the guillotine stood still. On July 29th, not a single name was called, not a single blade fell. Prisons emptied faster than their keepers could comprehend. Food markets reopened, laughter returned to taverns, and churches once sealed by decree filled again with worshippers. After 3 years of silence and suspicion, the air of France changed. It was as if an entire nation, held under water, finally came up for breath. And Robespierre? He was given no monument, no funeral rites. He and his allies were dumped into a common grave, quicklime scattered to erase their flesh, their resting place unmarked, their memory meant to dissolve like ash in the soil. The man who had recorded every victim with meticulous detail vanished into the earth with none. He had believed that terror was virtue, that death was justice, that fear could build a republic. In the end, it consumed him as it had consumed so many others. The revolution moved on without him, and history left him as it found him. A man convinced of his righteousness, blind to the horror he had become. Robespierre's execution was not merely the fall of a man. It was the collapse of a system, proof that even the master of fear cannot escape its blade. If you want to journey deeper into these cursed moments of history, don't look away. Subscribe to Curse Chronicles, like this story, and share your thoughts below. Together, we'll keep dragging the past out of its grave, one shadow at a time.